From your new book, Diversity Delusion, we are cultivating students who lack all understanding of the principles of the American founding.
They're ignorant, and they are encouraged in their ignorance by faculty and above all by an ever-growing diversity bureaucracy on college campuses. This is why college tuition is so high. You have people like Jerry Kang at the University of California at Los Angeles, who's their vice chancellor for equity, diversity, and inclusion, making $444,000 a year for nothing. There is not a single professor at UCLA who is discriminating against females or students of color. These are the most open-minded, compassionate individuals in human history. Universities are the most tolerant environments in human history, except for conservatives, of course, but they are not discriminating. And yet, these students are told by the adults on campus that they are victims. They have never read the Constitution. They do not understand the challenges, the difficulty that Anglo-American culture developed in creating something as precious as the rule of law and constitutional government.
From your book, you talk about UC San Diego, and you talk about their diversocrat position in their diversity apparatus, and that includes the staff diversity liaison, the graduate diversity coordinators, the undergraduate student diversity liaison, the graduate student diversity liaison, the chief diversity officer, the director of development for diversity initiatives, the Office of Academic Diversity and Equal Opportunity, the Committee on Gender Identity and Sexual Orientation Issues, the Committee on the Status of Women, the Campus Council on Climate Change, or Climate Culture and Inclusion, the Diversity Council, Cross-Cultural Center, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Resource Center, and the Women's Center. Are those all separate entities?
Of course, separate and separately funded. Now that was in 2012. I can guarantee you, Peter, that the list has grown exponentially because students and their codependent diversity bureaucrats are forever generating new categories of victimhood in order to expand their realm. Again, this is extremely costly. Berkeley's diversity of equity inclusion bureaucracy costs $20 million a year. Parents understand that tuition is going up because of this nonsense, and it is treated in the public discourse as if tuition is some naturally occurring phenomenon. It is not. It is completely within the control of universities. The solution is not more federal funding. The solution is to hack back at this diversity bureaucracy that is premised on a lie.
But Heather McDonald, you're a privileged white woman from LA, live in New York City.
Yes.
You have a different experience than some of these students of color or students that don't have your background.
Any student on an American college campus today, I don't care if he's green, purple, or orange, is among the most privileged human beings in history simply by virtue of having access to the thing that Faust sold his soul for, which is knowledge. He can read any book that has ever been written, something that would have driven the Renaissance humanists mad with envy and desire. He has access to scientific laboratories that are most advanced in the world. For any student on a college campus to think of himself as oppressed is a fundamental error. And if he thinks he's oppressed and is that delusional, that is a chip on his shoulder that is going to encumber him for the rest of his life. The obsession with the irrelevancy of gonads and melanin is destroying humanistic learning and is destroying the ability of students to take advantage of resources that are simply unparalleled.
Any college president who adopts the rhetoric of safe spaces is already lost.
Absolutely. The adults on campus have a responsibility towards their students. It's an intellectual responsibility primarily, but it is also one of encouraging those students to move towards an adult understanding of reality. And what it means to be an adult is to understand the difference between a real problem and a trivial problem. The microaggression movement that we're coming up with is based on trivial problems. One of the classic microaggressions that gets passed around on one student video of another, of maudlin students wailing about being victims of microaggression, is being asked by your fellow freshmen, so like, what are you? Meaning, what ethnicity are you? This is supposedly life-threatening bigotry. That's absurd. We are been told that the most important thing about people's identities is, in fact, their racial or ethnic identity. A college president that encourages students to think of themselves as oppressed is doing those students an enormous disservice. Instead, he should remind them that these are 4 precious years for them to experience the greatest works of human creation, to wallow in beauty, in grandeur, in accomplishment, in tragedy, in comedy. And instead, you have people like Yale's president, Peter Salovey, who after a student mob screamed and cursed at one of the most respected sociologists in the country for 3 hours. I won't even repeat their language because I'm afraid you would have to bleep it out. Peter Salovey said he'd never been so moved and proud of his students as what he had witnessed. And 2 of those student mobsters who were engaged in just extraordinarily impolite and boorish behavior were actually given a racial justice award by the university. Those students are not being led towards an adult understanding of their privilege.
Heather Mac Donald, what was your path to the Manhattan Institute, where you're a fellow, and to being an author, best-selling author of The War on Cops, and now this latest book?
Well, I had aspired to a career in academia. I thought of nothing more life-enhancing than the privilege of being able to read great literature. And so I started a PhD at Yale University, which is where I did my undergraduate degree in comparative literature. But by then, I had started to realize that the very abstruse literary theory that I had been an unquestioning acolyte of as an undergraduate, something called deconstruction, was a complete fraud. The narrative about language and literature that was propounded by deconstruction was actually lunacy. And yet this had taken over the entirety of the humanities at that point. And so I left. I went to law school thinking I would study the things that I was most interested in, which are problems of language and interpretation there. But I kept sort of testing the waters because I still yearned for an academic life. But I found every time I went back and looked into academia, it was getting nuttier and nuttier. I was in college in the 1970s. As strange as deconstruction was, I was very fortunate because I was allowed to read Wordsworth, Milton, Edmund Spencer, some of the greatest authors in English literature, without anybody thinking to complain about their gonads and melanin. I was never taught to ask, well, it's a male author. I don't see myself reflected in that. Absurd. That's an absurd know-nothing response. By the 80s, identity politics had completely taken over. You had the travesty chant at Stanford University, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. Are you kidding me? You students think you have the right, without even understanding what Western civilization is, to trash it like that? And so I became more and more upset and angry at this know-nothing attack on a tradition that has given us not just beauty, but freedom, prosperity, an access to resources that was unthinkable 500 years ago. And so I started writing about the destruction of the university.